In this video, I'm going to be explaining the 4 deepest levels of this ancient Egypt iceberg I made, containing all the most esoteric information about ancient Egypt I know. Now, the reason I haven't released my explanation of the first 4 levels, which I did make, is because someone happened to do it for me. They did a pretty good job, and I'll link it in the description. But today, we're going to be diving down into what I consider the most fascinating part of this iceberg. Trust me, it contains some pretty wild stuff. In the middle, where the part of the iceberg that's underwater is, you'll learn about things you'd usually only learn about after spending a while looking into ancient Egypt. At the very bottom, below the iceberg itself, is where the most esoteric aspects of ancient Egypt I know are. So basically just follow the guy next to each level. So without further ado, let's dive down this iceberg. Level 5, Cache of the Slain Soldiers. This refers to a tomb in Deir el-Bahri in Thebes, which contained the intermingled, unmummified bodies of 60 slain soldiers, dating to sometime in the early Middle Kingdom. Be warned, some of the pictures I might show are a bit macabre. It was originally thought that these men were the soldiers who died fighting for Amenhotep II of the 11th Dynasty during his reunification of Egypt. It's now believed that they died fighting for Amenhotep I, founder of the 12th Dynasty, during the turmoil that engulfed Egypt for much of his reign, which I've actually made a video about. It's possible that they were hastily buried there after a battle in Thebes. All of their bodies show evidence of violence, and many were killed with arrows, maybe fired from the battlements of a city they were besieging. At least 6 of the men still carried the traces of being picked at by vultures, showing that they had lain on the battlefield for quite some time. They were also buried with military equipment like archers' wrist guards, one of which was still wrapped around the wrist of its owner. The tomb was first discovered in 1923 by Herbert E. Winlock on behalf of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, but its significance wasn't actually realized until 3 years later, when re-examination of the tomb showed that the bandages on the bodies carried the names of men from the Middle Kingdom. Paneb. If you've looked a bit into the characters that lived in Deir el-Medina, especially John Romer's Ancient Lives, you've probably heard about this guy. Deir el-Medina was a village in western Thebes that housed the workmen who created the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. There are a lot of literary records from Deir el-Medina, so the lives and even the personalities of its inhabitants have sort of been figured out. And one of them, a chief workman named Paneb, who lived during the late 19th to 20th dynasties, was a real piece of work, let me tell you. His fellow workmen accused him of a very long list of different crimes. He stole a lot from his job site, for one thing. He stole tools and also stone meant for royal tombs and used them for his own tomb. And he also stole various grave goods meant for the pharaohs and their families. He also forced the workers under him and their wives to do various household chores for him, like weaving clothes. He even once drank wine while sitting on the sarcophagus of Pharaoh Seti II. In addition to all that, he was also a pretty violent guy. One night he even attempted to kill his adopted father, the chief workman Neferhotep. In the process, he chased him all over the village and beat up 9 other guys. As a result, Neferhotep lodged a complaint with the vizier, basically Egypt's prime minister, and this led to a really weird incident, probably wrapped up in the politics of the time, where the vizier was fired after Paneb lodged a complaint directly to Pharaoh. Paneb's also been accused of throwing bricks at people from the top of a wall, and even of sexual assault. All these accusations come from Papyrus Salt 124 in the British Museum, which was written by a guy named Amenhotep, who felt that he was cheated out of the position of chief workman by Paneb, who also bribed a vizier for it. So he may have been a bit biased, but we have corroborating evidence that Paneb did all this stuff. Ankhtifi. If you've delved into the First Intermediate Period or even seen a documentary mentioning it, you've probably heard of this guy and his tomb at the Upper Egyptian site of El Moala, which is literally just known for this one tomb. The chaotic First Intermediate Period was caused by the provinces and their rulers, known as nomarchs, becoming more autonomous at the end of the Old Kingdom, to the point where the pharaoh in Memphis was hardly anything more than a figurehead. And Ankhtifi was one of these nomarchs, controlling 3 nomes in Upper Egypt. His tomb autobiography talks about how much people were suffering from famine and civil strife at the time, and how while the rest of the country starved, he was able to take care of his gnomes. He even claims that some people resorted to eating their own children. Ultimately, it's one of the most significant surviving texts from the period, and it's pretty interesting. Pataikos figurines. This refers to a type of protective amulet worn at the neck depicting a bald dwarf, often shown trampling crocodiles and holding dangerous animals like snakes in his hands. Pataikos is identified with Ptah, the patron of craftsmen, and the god that created everything in the world by speaking their names according to the people in Memphis. There were different creation stories across Egypt, by the way. The term Pataikos was first used by Herodotus, who used it to describe statues that the Phoenicians carried around on the prows of their triremes, which he said looked similar to a cult statue of Ptah that Cambyses II, the Persian conqueror of Egypt, laughed uproariously at, quite rudely. The original Egyptian name of these statues isn't actually known, though. Tomb Uj. This refers to an incredibly significant pre-dynastic royal tomb found in the El Kab, the royal necropolis of an important pre-dynastic political center, Thynus. Although it pales in comparison to later dynastic royal tombs, this was the largest tomb of its period by far. It also contained 400 imported vessels from the Levant, from as far north as Lebanon. These vessels were found with dozens of inscribed bone labels, which formed the earliest corpus of writing found in all of Egypt. These labels mention places where commodities taken to the royal court at Thynus had come from, including towns as far away as Lower Egypt, which the occupant of Tomb Uj may have exercised control over. The occupant of Tomb Uj was also buried with an ivory shepherd's crook, an unambiguous symbol of kingship which would endure throughout the dynastic period. Based on these labels, the ruler it belonged to may have been named Scorpion, so literally the Scorpion King the rock played that one time. Taken all together, Tomb Uj's occupant may have ruled all of the northern Nile Valley, and it's even possible that during his time, the creation of a unified Egypt may have been well underway. Beit Khallaf. This refers to a mysterious site in Upper Egypt containing two large 3rd Dynasty mastabas, or bench tombs. It was discovered in 1901 by John Garstang, and the two mastabas were dubbed K1 and K2. Seal impressions bearing the name of Djoser, who famously built the step pyramid at Saqqara, were found in K1, and the name of another pharaoh of the 3rd Dynasty, Hekanakht, was found in K2. This led Garstang to believe that these were the tombs of these two pharaohs, although it's now thought that they might just be private tombs dating from their reigns. Notably, the barrel vaults found within K1 are the oldest known in Egypt. But there's another aspect of this unique discovery that garnered a bit more attention. The skeleton of an unusually tall man, possibly Hekanakht himself, was discovered in K2. He was only 6 feet 1 inches tall, but that was very, very tall for his time. In 2017, it was even determined that he's the earliest known case of gigantism, which is pretty neat, I guess. World's first zoo. This refers to how what can be called the earliest known zoo in the world was discovered at the important pre-dynastic site of Nekhen, also known as Heracompolis in Upper Egypt. The bones of a variety of different exotic animals were found buried along the city's elites, some even with expensive grave goods of their own. They include baboons, elephants, cats, dogs, a leopard, crocodiles, aurochs, which are like wild cows, hippos, gazelles, and even more. It isn't clear whether they were just pets in a royal menagerie or if their presence had more meaning. It's possible that they were ritually sacrificed to symbolically bring nature under control, or maybe to act as intermediaries to the gods they represented. It's also possible that some of these animals were the spiritual manifestations of the life essence, or Ka, of Nekhen's pre-dynastic kings, especially since pre-dynastic kings tended to have names equating them with intimidating animals, like scorpions, bulls, crocodiles, elephants, and even catfish, which is what the name of the first pharaoh, Narmer, alludes to. 28th Dynasty. The 28th Dynasty is the only one of Manetho's dynasties that's only made up of one guy, Amorteus, so really it isn't even a dynasty. After around 125 years of Persian rule between 525 and 401 BC, he ejected all Persian forces from Egypt and brought about the last period of native Egyptian rule before the 20th century. Despite this, he was ousted from power and executed almost immediately after he had consolidated it by Nepherites I, founder of the slightly longer-lived 29th dynasty. And to make matters worse, almost nothing is known about Amorteus' reign, and his name hasn't even been found in hieroglyphs yet. Amenhotep equals Seti II's son. You might not recognize who these two guys are, but they were pharaohs of the late 19th dynasty, right around when Paneb was fucking around in Deir el-Medina. They were actually rival pharaohs who fought a civil war over the throne soon after the death of Ramses II's son and successor, Menptah. Amenhotep was actually the pharaoh that fired the vizier who Paneb complained about. Scholars used to think that they were half-brothers, but in Aidan Dodson's excellent book about the period, Poisoned Legacy, he theorizes that Seti II could have actually been Amenhotep's father. We know Amenhotep's mother was a woman named Hekanakht, as she appears on two statues of him. Inscriptions on both statues refer to her with the titles of King's Daughter and King's Mother. But on one statue, the title of King's Mother was recarved into the title of King's Wife, presumably after Seti II, spoiler alert, wrenched control over Upper Egypt back from Amenhotep. This means that Hekanakht was a mother in the politically correct canon of Amenhotep's regime and a wife in the canon of Seti II's regime, each ignoring the existence of the other in such monumental inscriptions. This can only mean that either Amenhotep was his rival's own son, or that Hekanakht was one of the wives of Seti's father, Merneptah, and as such the two rival pharaohs would be half-brothers. Seti II eventually won the civil war, of course, and we don't know what happened to Amenhotep except that he was denied burial in the tomb he had built in the Valley of the Kings for himself. But the thought that Seti II may have had to bring himself to execute his own son is pretty evocative. Animal mummies. It's commonly believed that the ancient Egyptians worshipped animals, especially cats, and lavished them with all sorts of different luxuries. That's sorta true, but it isn't exactly right. In fact, the ancient Egyptians slaughtered and then mummified without eating millions upon millions of a huge variety of animals. And by huge variety, I mean there's a huge variety of them. They mummified fish, snakes, lizards, rodents, crocodiles, hawks, falcons, ibises, baboons, bulls, rams, cats, dogs, and even more. And the ancient Egyptians literally did make millions of them, interring them in sprawling catacombs. There's one catacomb in Saqqara, like many others, just filled floor to ceiling with jars stuffed with falcon mummies. There were animals mummified because they were someone's beloved pet or they were meant to be food for someone in the afterlife, but many of them were killed and mummified because they were meant to be votive offerings to the gods they represented. For example, cats were of course sacred to the cat-headed fertility goddess Bastet. Ibises and baboons were sacred to the god of wisdom, Thoth, and falcons were sacred to the sky god, Horus. So if you wanted to wish for something from a particular god, or if you wanted to thank them for granting some wish, you'd go down to their temple and ask the priest there to make you an animal mummy, since it was thought that the animal would relay your message to the god when it reached the afterlife. And unfortunately, the animal mummy industry involves some pretty messed up stuff. Sometimes kittens had their skulls crushed, and live ibises were just dipped in molten resin. Animal mummies are actually a huge subject, so I won't go any further into it, but I'd recommend looking at the work of Dr. Salima Ikram. She's definitely the top animal mummy scholar at the time. Level 6. Cannibal Hymn. The Cannibal Hymn is an especially interesting section of the pyramid texts, which were royal funerary texts mainly carved onto the interiors of pyramids, from the 5th to 6th dynasties at the end of the Old Kingdom. The pyramid texts were basically an instruction manual for surviving in the afterlife, and they were meant to be spoken aloud by priests. Utterances 273 and 274 of these pyramid texts are known as the Cannibal Hymn, and they only appear in the pyramids of the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, Unas, and the founder of the 6th dynasty, Teti. It describes the deceased catching, slaughtering, and then eating the gods in order to absorb their power and add to his divinity, becoming the ultimate power and lasting forever. Several other bloodthirsty deities assist in the slaughter, including the moon god Khonsu and the blood god Shezmu. Let me read out my favorite part. Their big ones are for his morning meal, their middle ones are for his evening meal, their little ones are for his night meal. Emile Amelineau. Emile Amelineau was a French Egyptologist, notoriously bad at his job. He was the first to excavate at the el Kab, the aforementioned necropolis of Egypt's first pharaohs. But saying he did a pretty shoddy job would be an understatement. Not only did he not record the fine spots of what he found, but he also actively destroyed what he found. According to the guy who excavated the el Kab after him, Flinders Petrie, he destroyed stone vases and pottery he didn't want anyone else to have, and just casually burnt up 5,000-year-old wooden furniture that had miraculously survived until he got his hands on them. After Amelineau was done and declared that there was nothing more to be found at the el Kab, Flinders Petrie came in. Despite the mess Amelineau had made, he was able to make incredibly important discoveries concerning Egypt's first pharaohs, and was able to entirely reconstruct the sequence of kings that had ruled during the first dynasty and even beyond. Oddly enough, Amelineau's main focus was actually Coptic theology, which he was one of the world's top scholars of, and before he became interested in that, he was ordained as a Catholic priest. Dynasty 00. This is a term used to refer to the pre-dynastic chiefs and kinglets which ruled different political centers in Egypt before the kings of Thutmose started the process of unifying it, culminating in Narmer. Dynasty 00 includes King Scorpion I, buried in Tomb Uj, as well as a whole bunch of other mysterious figures with wacky animal names, attested by ivory labels from the same cemetery, which may just represent misinterpreted place names. However, some others are attested from other sources, like the so-called Libyan palette, as well as maybe the graffiti on the Colossus set up by Narmer at Koptos. But all in all, this period is very complicated and shrouded in mystery, so I'm not going to delve into it further. Badarians. Higher up in the iceberg, I put Nakata 1 through 3, referring to the three cultural phases that immediately preceded the formation of Egypt in 3000 BC. Well, the Badarian culture is what preceded that, existing from between 4400 to 4000 BC. It's even possible that they emerged as early as 5000 BC. So 7,000 years ago. It's named after the site of El Badari in Upper Egypt, where it was first identified in the 20s. Characterized by their remarkably thin-walled, black-top pottery, they also sometimes buried their dead with strange female mortuary figures made of ivory. They were the first culture to practice agriculture in Upper Egypt, and also created some of the earliest metal artifacts known from all of Egypt. Red-pilled Amenhotep II. This refers to the most based pharaoh ever to live, Amenhotep II, 7th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. He committed acts of ruthlessness that would almost certainly be considered war crimes today. He deeply mistrusted non-Egyptians, which we actually know from his own words. He ruled the Egyptian empire at its territorial peak. He deliberately excluded every woman he knew except his mom from government, and he was incredibly fit and active. And what more do I have to say? He was truly the perfect pharaoh. Australia. This refers to crackpot conspiracy theories that the ancient Egyptians colonized Australia. The main evidence for this that its proponents point to is the fact that the ancient Egyptians developed throwing sticks that are vaguely similar to boomerangs. I'm not kidding. They also point to something called the Gosford Glyphs, which are a series of obviously fake hieroglyphs etched into some rocks in New South Wales sometime in the 80s. There's also a bunch of other supposed ancient Egyptian pyramids and artifacts and whatnot found in Australia, so look it up if you need a laugh. Hekanakht Papyri. This refers to a significant set of letters from the early 12th dynasty, which provides a fascinating insight into the lives and finances of what was basically a middle-class ancient Egyptian family of the time. It was discovered by the Metropolitan Museum right before they found the cache of the slain soldiers in another tomb at Deir el-Bahri. They were written by a mortuary priest named Hekanakht working in Thebes to his family living near the new capital of Idij Tawi near the Fayum, and they really give you a sense of his personality. It also gives us an insight into the chaos of the early 12th dynasty, since a large chunk of the letters are concerned with Hekanakht having to decrease the grain rations he gives to his family because of a famine afflicting Egypt at the time. He even says that the people where he lived started eating each other, although that might be a joke. KV 55 Mummy Theories. This refers to the intense debate surrounding the identity of this mummy, or rather skeleton, discovered in KV 55, itself a very mysterious tomb in the Valley of the Kings. I called it a mummy because at first it was, but immediately after it was discovered in 1907, the soft tissue crumbled to dust. At no fault of the excavators, by the way. The tomb contained objects originally included among the burials of the royal family of the Amarna period, which is, of course, one of the most perplexing periods in all ancient Egyptian history. This includes the desecrated coffin the KB-55 skeleton was found in, which was probably repurposed from a royal lady. I can't get into all the details here, but there are basically two theories concerning the mummy's identity. One holds that he's Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh who was at the center of the Amarna period. Another holds that he's actually a guy called Smenkhkare, who ruled as co-regent with Akhenaten near the end of his reign, only to die before him. He was possibly Akhenaten's younger brother. I personally think it's more likely that the skeleton is Smenkhkare, mainly because it seems to be too young to be Akhenaten, but who knows. There's also debate surrounding the skeleton's relationship to the mummies of other Amarna period royalty, seeing as genetic testing conducted in 2010 indicate he may have been the father or brother of King Tut, that his own father was Amenhotep III, and that he wasn't the father of the mummy dubbed KV-21A, which is thought to be King Tut's sister wife Ankhesenamun, who was definitely Akhenaten's daughter. I'm telling you, all this stuff about the Amarna period is mind-bendingly complicated, but the results of these tests have themselves been disputed. So essentially, the KV-55 skeleton is a mystery inside a mystery, inside another mystery, inside a bigger mystery. So let's move on. Level 7. Now we're in really deep. Prince Amenhotep. This refers to the mummy of a boy disemboweled by looters, which is currently standing propped up against a wall in a side chamber of KV-43, the tomb of Amenhotep II's son, Thutmose IV, in the Valley of the Kings. It's thought that he's the Prince Amenhotep, whose canopic equipment was found in the tomb when Howard Carter discovered it in 1903, 19 years before he discovered King Tut. The canopic equipment of a princess named Tentamun was also found, but her body hasn't been found yet. But it's also been theorized that this Prince Amenhotep is actually in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. That's because the coffin and mummy of a royal infant, also named Prince Amenhotep, was discovered by the museum's Egyptian expedition high up in the cliffs of western Thebes in 1919. The coffin is a stock coffin from the Third Intermediate period, when royal mummies were being hidden away to protect them from looters. Many had ended up in a nearby cache, DB320, which I mentioned near the top of the iceberg. A beautiful little pictorial found on the boy's wrappings depict the deified 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep I smiting Egypt's enemies. As such, it's possible that this is Amenhotep I's son, not Thutmose's. Unfortunately, it was also found that the boy's body had been dismembered by looters. Both the young age and the treatment of these little princes in death is pretty sad, but at least their memory lives on through us talking about them. Green Sahara and Nabta Playa. This refers to a time when the Sahara Desert was actually habitable, and when the distant ancestors of the ancient Egyptians were living as pastoralists there. The Nabta Playa Basin is 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel in the Sahara Desert, and in the Neolithic it was a seasonally filled lake that attracted sub-Saharan nomads. They made pottery decorated with crazy patterns, possibly made using combs, but they're most notable for the megalithic structures they created and how extraordinarily organized they were for the time. Around 5500 BC, the people of Nabta Playa started burying sacrificial cows in clay-lined chambers covered with mounds of broken sandstone, which may be a distant ancestor of some parts of ancient Egyptian religion. They also built a stone circle around 4800 BC that was used to mark out the summer solstice, and possibly as a calendar circle. It's also been theorized that the stone circle is supposed to mark out the location of a bunch of other stars, but that's pretty controversial. Ephemeral Middle Kingdom Nubian Dynasty. This refers to an incredibly mysterious group of pretender pharaohs based in Lower Nubia sometime during the Middle Kingdom, but I think most likely around the early 12th dynasty in the reign of Amenhotep I. I mentioned them briefly in my video on Amenhotep, and I think it's likely that they were some sort of offshoot of the 11th dynasty, whose last pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, was probably usurped by Amenhotep. After all, Lower Nubia was an important source of mercenaries for the 11th dynasty. The dynasty's 3 kings are only attested by rock inscriptions from different sites in Lower Nubia, only one of which says anything besides just their names, and they aren't acknowledged by later king lists at all. They're named Wajkare Segerseni, Kakare Ini, and Ib Kentire Gereg Tawi. Kakare Ini's name contains an allusion to the 8th dynasty pharaoh Kakare Ibi, as well as an abbreviated form of the name Intef, which was used by the first 3 pharaohs of the 11th dynasty. Segerseni's throne name, Wajkare, may also reference another obscure 8th dynasty pharaoh. Their names are also generally similar to those of Amenhotep III of the 11th dynasty. The name Segerseni is also definitely Nubian, so maybe these guys represent a sort of short-lived independent Nubian kingdom. The only inscription that says anything besides a name is one of the 2 mentioning Segerseni at Khor Dehmet, also known as Umbarakab. It reads, "Order made to the son of the ruler, that he might overthrow the enemies of his father, the Horus Ankh-Numre, the king Wajkare, son of Re, Segerseni, in the north of Persenbebet, looking at Zeka and Wag." This mysterious text probably references a battle, possibly against the forces of Amenhotep I, fought near Aswan. We don't know if Segerseni's son won that battle, but either way, Amenhotep came out on top. In his 29th regnal year, his vizier Ankhtifi laid waste to Lower Nubia, and it was annexed into the Egyptian Empire. Horemheb and Aye's bones. This refers to the fact that the skeletal remains of the pharaohs Horemheb and Aye, who reigned right after Tutankhamun at the end of the 18th dynasty, are still possibly sitting in their respective tombs in the Valley of the Kings, or at least they were until relatively recently. Horemheb's beautifully painted tomb, KV-57, was discovered in 1908 by the same guy who discovered KV-55, Edward Ayrton. When it was first entered, a skull and other bones were found in Horemheb's sarcophagus, and other human remains were found scattered on the floor of the burial chamber and in various side chambers. As such, it's been theorized that KV-57 was meant to be a 3rd royal mummy cache, but that unlike the other 2, looters eventually got to it. The king's intestines were also found in his smashed canopic chest. A bunch of other amazing objects were recovered from the tomb, which are incredibly similar to objects in King Tut's, giving a tantalizing glimpse into what it would have been like originally. Geoffrey Martin, who re-excavated the tomb, stated that by holding a flashlight under the sarcophagus's lid, you could actually see skeletal material within it. Unfortunately, he also recounts that tourists slipped in various bits of trash when the top was open. He also obtained permission to lift the enormously heavy lid from the sarcophagus, and the shattered remnants of what's probably Horemheb's body and maybe 2 other people were revealed yet again. The location of all the other bones found in 1908 are unfortunately completely unknown, so this and some other small fragments collected by Geoffrey Martin are all we have left of them. Aye is sorta in the same boat, which is sort of ironic since Horemheb was actually the guy who had Aye's tomb desecrated and expunged all the depictions of him in it. Aye's tomb is in the Western Valley of the Kings, and so it's called WV-23. It was discovered all the way back in 1816 by the adventurer Giovanni Belzoni, but it was fully excavated in 1972 by the University of Minnesota under Otto Schaden. Half of a human pelvis was found in the well chamber of the tomb, and more skeletal remains were discovered in the burial chamber and the final chamber of the tomb beyond that, which might represent Aye and his wife Tay. It's also possible that Aye was among the mummies moved to Horemheb's tomb, or that his skeleton was the rewrapped yellow skeleton found in the nearby tomb WV-25, along with 7 Third Intermediate Period mummies, by Belzoni, again in 1817. The University of Minnesota also fully excavated WV-25 and recovered fragments of these mummies and the yellow skeleton, which were set aside for study. I don't know where they are now, but hopefully they're safe, and maybe one day we'll learn if they're really Aye. Hedgehog Goddess. This refers to a peculiar goddess with a hedgehog on her head who is only known from a single 26th dynasty tomb in Bahariya Oasis. The tomb belonged to a merchant named Benentiu, who may have been a Libyan, suggesting that Abbasid might be of Libyan origin, although this is debated. She's depicted twice in the tomb's central hall, once with a ram-headed figure which might represent the soul of the sun god Ra, and another time with Ra Harakti. It also seems like she's deeply connected to another goddess, perhaps Isis. Her name may even mean to praise Isis. Hedgehogs were a symbol of protection to the ancient Egyptians, and there are lots of surviving hedgehog amulets, and they're also shown decorating the prows of ships sometimes. It's also possible hedgehogs were seen as representative of the sun when they roll up into a ball, with their quills sort of looking like the sun's rays. Ironically, Abbasid is one of, if not the first, ancient Egyptian deity to come alphabetically, if you were to make a list of them. Level 8. Okay, now we're in the deepest level. Slovenian sarcophagi. I'm referring to how two massive Old Kingdom sarcophagi from Giza are just sitting in a cemetery in the small town of Vipava in Slovenia. It's something no one really talks about, but I find it pretty interesting. They were taken there by the Austro-Hungarian Consul General of Egypt, Sir Anton Levrin, who was from Vipava, and he had his parents and his 8-year-old son interred in these massive sarcophagi. The sarcophagi originally belonged to a high official named in the sources I've used as Raver, and the other belonged to a prince named Yunmin, possibly a son of Menkaure. In Egypt, Mr. Levrin amassed a large collection of Egyptian antiquities and dutifully sent them to various institutions back home. In 1849, he even sold part of it to Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian, the guy who tried and failed to become Emperor of Mexico, for his castle, Miramare Castle, near Trieste. There's still a Ptolemaic-looking sphinx sitting on a pier there. Levrin also donated the coffin and mummy of a priest of Amun, as well as a 12-foot-long mummified crocodile to what's now the National Museum of Slovenia in Ljubljana. Ancient Egyptians equal Japanese. This is probably the wildest theory about the ancient Egyptians' identity I've ever heard, and I only heard it once, and obviously it's completely off the mark. But I'll give you this picture of actual samurai in front of the Great Sphinx, because I think it's pretty cool. Thutmose IV's Heart Scarab. Thutmose IV is a pretty underrated pharaoh, and at one point I was even going to make a mini documentary on him. I literally made like 80 pages of handwritten notes for it too. I discovered a truly fascinating fact while deep into my research while looking at the footnotes of a book covering his tomb, KV43, by C.N. Reeves. It was the fact that Thutmose IV's heart scarab, which originally sat right on top of his chest on his mummy, in order to ensure that his heart didn't tell the gods about any potential sins he committed in life, was discovered in Sardinia. It wasn't discovered on his mummy, it wasn't discovered in his tomb, and it wasn't even discovered anywhere in Egypt. It was discovered during illicit excavations at an archaeological site called Tharos on the west coast of Sardinia. We know KV43 was robbed as early as the late 18th dynasty, since there's graffiti in the tomb testifying to it being inspected by the treasurer Maya in the 8th regnal year of Horemheb, and Thutmose IV's mummy was taken to the tomb he buried his father, Amenhotep II, in KV35, sometime in the 3rd intermediate period. Tharos was inhabited by the Phoenicians, but it also may have been inhabited by Sardinia's Nuragic civilization, which might be the source of the Shardana warriors who attacked and also eventually settled in Egypt. But still, no one has any idea how Thutmose IV's heart scarab got to Sardinia, and I haven't ever seen anyone talk about it except for Reeves and the Italian guy who was somehow able to publish it during World War II. He also recorded that it's currently sitting somewhere in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, but I haven't really been able to find it. Out of all the stories of ancient Egyptian objects winding up in wacky places far, far away from Egypt, I mean, this has to take the cake. This was an object that was sitting on the mummy of a pharaoh, and somehow it ended up on the other side of the Mediterranean. Imagine the stories this thing could tell if it could talk. Okay, now we're at the very end of the iceberg, and there's one more topic I have to tell you about, but I'm not sure if I should. It's so secret. It's so esoteric. I don't know if I can do this. Well, Alright, you have it. Born in Arizona.
Babylonian king.